There will be voter fraud. Yes. And there will be voter suppression. Yes. It's inevitable. When you have more than 100 million people voting all over the country, you're going to have some of both. But I'm here to tell you that voter suppression is a much more serious problem than voter fraud. And you can do something about voter suppression. You'll hear what on The Dirt Show. Don't expect perfection in this election. It's not going to happen. There will be voter fraud. There will be voter suppression. But I'm here to tell you that voter suppression is much more dangerous and much worse than voter fraud. In our country and in every democracy, there is always some voter fraud. There are always going to be some bad guys. There are always going to be some corrupt politicians. There are always going to be some people who will try to vote twice. That's always going to be a problem. It's been a problem from our first election, and it will be a problem to our last election. But it doesn't have major impacts on the election in general. There have been occasions, the allegations in Chicago in the 1960 election still reverberate among historians. But in general, voter suppression has been a much greater problem for Americans. We've always had voter suppression. Trivial pursuit question. There were about 5 million people living in America during the famous 1800 election. Remember the 1800 election? If you saw Hamilton, it was Jefferson versus Adams, and then there was the fight between Jefferson and Burr. You all remember the story. Great, great election. 5 or so million people in the United States of America. Guess how many voted in that election? Of 5 million people, 65,000 people voted. A little over 1%. Why? Because to vote, you had to be white. You had to be male. You had to own property. In some states, you had to be Protestant. We had already eliminated basically religious tests in the federal government because of the Constitution, but states still had religious tests. And then there was massive voter suppression. So 1.25% of the population elected Thomas Jefferson. The same was true for subsequent elections. The Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams, very tiny percentage of the population voted. And we had that even through the election of Abraham Lincoln. We only began to have large numbers of voters with the enfranchisement of former slaves and African Americans in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, then women, then young people. And now we have a very large percentage of our population over the age of 18 is eligible to vote. Not everybody takes advantage of that. We still have a lot of voluntary voter suppression, people who just don't come out and vote. You know, in some countries, you have to pay a penalty, a fine, if you don't vote. You have to vote. You don't have to vote for anybody. You can vote X, you can vote for Donald Duck, but you have to come and cast a ballot, either in person or by mail. In America, you have the right not to vote, and too many people take advantage of that right. In this election, we're going to see 3 kinds of major issues. One, we're going to see some voter fraud. Don't let the Democrats persuade you the Republicans are 100% wrong about voter fraud. There will be some voter fraud, probably more than usual because of the mail-in ballots. But don't let the Republicans persuade you, Democrats, that there won't be voter suppression. There will be massive voter suppression, as there always have been, and it will be primarily directed at people of color, minorities, and others who tend to vote Democrat. So you're going to have those two, fraud, and you're going to have suppression. Those are both deliberate and willful and criminal and shouldn't happen. Then you're going to have malfeasance. You're just going to have mess-ups. You're going to have screw-ups. Boy, do I remember one of them very well. I still don't know to this day whether it was deliberate or not. But I was deeply involved in the butterfly ballot. You remember the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County in the year 2000 when the hole in which you put your vote was put in the wrong place, and it looked like it was next to the name of Joe Lieberman, who was running for vice president with Al Gore, but instead it was actually the vote for Pat Buchanan. I can assure you that no Jews in Palm Beach County wanted to vote for Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan is an overt anti-Semite. He has engaged in Holocaust denial. He's opposed the existence and survival of Israel. He's made statements about Judaism. Even Bill Buckley, a fellow conservative, said that what Buchanan had done and said amounts to anti-Semitism. But putting that aside, one thing is very clear. There isn't a single Jew in Palm Beach County who wanted to vote for Pat Buchanan. But Pat Buchanan got hundreds of votes, probably enough to make the difference statewide between a victory for Al Gore and a victory for George W. Bush. What do you do now? You can't give the Pat Buchanan votes over to Al Gore. You can't psychoanalyze. Of course you can. Everybody knows who these voters were likely to vote for, but you can't make those kinds of generalizations about voters of any ethnic group. So we're going to get that. We're going to get that. But historically, voter suppression has been far, far worse, and it's been targeted, as I said, to minorities. So if you have to tolerate a small amount of voter fraud in order to get a very large amount of eligible voters to vote, that's a trade-off that it inevitably has to happen. It has to be worth it. Better one fraudulent ballot be counted than 10 legitimate votes be suppressed. Inevitably, you're going to get a little bit more fraud and more mistakes as you expand the suffrage. The more people vote, the more fraud there was going to be. There was very little fraud in the 1800 election, 6,500 white men property owners voting. Pretty easy to control that small group of voters. But when you get millions of people, close to 100 million people have already voted the day before Election Day, this is a revolution in the way voting occurred. By the way, a little bit of a throwback to 1800. In 1800, there was no Election Day. You couldn't have an Election Day because people had to travel distances, and there was an election month. People voted during most of an entire month. And it was only into December when we knew the outcome. The outcome of the popular vote in that election was overwhelmingly in favor of Jefferson. So Jefferson clearly beat Adams. Adams was out of the picture. But then along comes Aaron Burr. And because of a mistake in the original Constitution, the same number of electoral votes were cast for Jefferson as for his vice presidential candidate, Burr. And Burr said, hey, I'm not a vice president. I'm a president. I got the same number of votes as you did. So it went to Congress, a mess. You remember from Hamilton. Finally, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, said, look, I don't like Jefferson's views, but Burr is a real bad guy with no good values. And eventually he paid a price for that, as we all know. And Hamilton threw the weight of his influence through the Federalist Party over to Jefferson. Jefferson won the election, served 2 terms with great distinction, bought Louisiana, did a lot of great things for America, all as the result of 65,000 voters and very, very little fraud. So you pay a price for having large numbers of people vote, but it's a price that's worth paying. Look, we're going to have an election, and the election may or may not be decided on election night. Obviously, if Biden were to win Florida and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio and the other contested battleground states early on, it would be fairly decisive. But President Trump has already said he's going to contest the Pennsylvania election, which may very well be close, as may Florida be close. And if Pennsylvania is contested and the 20-something votes of Pennsylvania can be the determining factor as Florida's were in 2000, we may not see the election decided on election day or election night. It may go to the courts, And when it goes to the courts, I just have one word of advice, and it's a word of advice that wasn't heeded by the Supreme Court in 2000 in Birch versus Gore. Don't expect perfection. Don't demand perfection. Just understand that there are essentially two kinds of mistakes: undercounting and overcounting. You overcount fraudulent ballots. You undercount when there's voter suppression. Undercounting is far worse in a democracy than overcounting. There's very little fraud in most elections, and there still is, tragically, massive voter suppression in most elections. Fraud tends to be on both sides. You don't have more fraud on one side than the other, generally. Historically, fraud was on the Democrat side because the Democrats owned the cities and the cities were corrupt. We know the Tweed Gang and all of that, and Chicago. But generally, fraud tends to equal itself out on both sides. Voter suppression does not equal itself out. Voter suppression tends to suppress minority voters. Minority voters tend to be Democrats. No generalizations. That's just the way the statistics play out. So when the courts look at these cases, and they will, don't demand perfection. Don't throw out a vote or a series of votes because it isn't perfect the way the Supreme Court did with the Chads in Florida in 2000. And if you have to err on one side or the other, err on the side of counting questionable votes rather than throwing out questionable votes. Err on the side of eliminating or reducing voter suppression rather than on the side of eliminating totally voter fraud. You'll never eliminate total fraud, totally. But you can eliminate or reduce very substantially voter suppression. Now, the worst problem of voter suppression statistically is self-suppression. As I mentioned earlier on, people just don't vote. No excuse. No excuse. I want every one of my listeners and viewers to go out there and vote. Do it carefully so you don't give them an excuse to not count your ballot. If there's voter suppression, wait online. Demand that your vote be counted. Don't let them discourage you or dissuade you. Stand up for your rights. Most important, vote. And if you vote, then you've paid your dues to America. You know, we used to have a poll tax. Thank God that was declared unconstitutional. We still have a form of a poll tax. It's inconvenient. Everybody has to put something aside to vote. I love voting, but a lot of people, you know, if they have family, if they have a job, it's a sacrifice. It's a poll tax in some ways, but it's a tax you ought to pay. It's the price of civilization and democracy. So vote. Whoever you're voting for, vote. And let's hope we have a fairly decisive outcome which doesn't require court intervention and that allows the will of the American public to prevail. That's my point of view about the coming election on The Durst Show. Now to our calls. The first one is from Bob in the most important state these days, Pennsylvania.
There are two different standards for slander and libel. One, if you're a regular person, and then here in the United States, if you're well known, then it's a higher standard to get to that. And if that is true, do you think that should be changed? That there should just be one standard? It shouldn't be a higher standard for somebody like you? And I guess that goes into my second part, which is I know you have, I believe, still a lawsuit against CNN. And I'm rooting for you in that lawsuit, hearing what you said they did to you, and that's what I can't stand these days. And if you can, please keep us up to date on that if you are allowed to do that. And again, I just wanted to hear your opinion on if there is a double standard with slander and libel for a well-known person against a regular person, is that true? And if so, do you think that should be changed to just have one standard?
What a great question. Thank you. I think the standard should be different for what are called public figures and ordinary folks. If you're an ordinary person who hasn't put yourself out there and somebody calls you a pedophile or whatever, you didn't invite that. You didn't ask for it. You're not in the public view. But if you're running for president of the United States and somebody says you're a liar, we want to be able to encourage people to say, very negative things about people running for public office. Now, the definition of who's a public figure is very questionable. And in my case, for example, I'm clearly a public figure. I've been on television. I've represented the president. I'm in the public light. And so people can defame me as long as they don't do it with malice, with reckless disregard for the truth. And what about the woman who accused me, Virginia Giuffre? Is she a public figure? Our argument is she's become a public figure. She went on television. She made the accusation. She made $160,000 money for making accusations. She's bringing lawsuits. She's complained against the Prince of England, the former majority leader of the Senate, the owner of Victoria's Secret, you name it. She has made herself a public figure. So as long as there's equality in that situation, I'm happy. The status of the lawsuit with CNN is we're going forward. We're not withdrawing the lawsuit. We're not settling the lawsuit. They're going to have to explain and justify why they doctored the tape, why they changed it to make me say exactly the opposite from what I said. I don't think they're going to be able to do that. Thanks very much for your call. Our next call is from Arizona, another important swing state. Diana.
Hi. I need to ask if you could please explain why we need the Electoral College. I've heard it explained. I get it, but then I don't get it. Thank you so much. Great show. We listen every day. Thanks.
Great question. The simple answer is we don't need the Electoral College. We may have needed it when the Constitution was first founded because, after all, we weren't really a country. We were the United States of America. Every state was sovereign, and we voted by state, essentially. And the Electoral College was designed for two reasons. One, so that the people didn't get to pick the president because our founders didn't trust the people. As I mentioned, hardly any of them voted. So we didn't want to leave it to the people. We wanted to leave it to wise, platonic guardians, older men who would figure out who the best president was likely to be. And that was the reason for the Electoral College, also to give smaller states a little bit of an advantage over larger states, which had the advantage in so many other aspects of governance. Both of those reasons no longer really exist, and I think most people, if they could do it over again, would eliminate the Electoral College. But today, because it benefits small states, and because it generally in the last years has benefited the Republican Party, I don't think you're going to get the kind of consensus required to pass a constitutional amendment. So I think we're stuck with the Electoral College, even though it has, I don't think today, much of a contemporary justification. Our next call is from Barbara in New Jersey.
Hello, Professor Dershowitz. I am calling to hear your brilliant opinion on what is happening today to our First Amendment rights. It certainly does not seem like the country that I grew up in. Things are changing, and it really scares me. I'd love to hear your point of view. Thank you.
Great question. It is a lot like the country I grew up in, because I grew up in the 1940s and 50s when we were victimized by McCarthyism, when people on the left did not have the right to express views that were contradicted by people on the right. So we had suppression, but it came from the right. Today we're having the exact opposite. We're having the left, particularly the hard left, and particularly on college and university campuses, suppress free speech in the name of political correctness, in the name of identity politics, you name it. But we are in a crisis of free speech. I have a book coming out in the next month called Cancel Culture, the newest attack on freedom of speech and due process, where I lay out what I think is going on college campuses today. And I think we have to fight back because our First Amendment rights are clearly in danger. So thanks for your observation and your call. Roger from my home state of Massachusetts.
So my question for you today is, what do you think of Trump's recent executive order to ban critical race theory in the military, all executive branch agencies, and all federal contractors? As always, thanks for the show. And I started watching your show last week, and you had 1,000 subscribers, but now you already have 2,000 subscribers in just a week. Thanks for the show.
Well, thank you so much. I hope we'll be up to 100,000 subscribers. If you keep listening and telling your friends, then we'll get more and more listeners and subscribers. Look, no government agency should ever ban any theory The question is, should it be affirmatively taught? Critical race theory is one of these newfangled, not particularly scholarly or empirically justified attempts to disguise politics and ideology as scholarship. I think it's a bunch of bunkum, and I think it's not particularly serious and academic, but it's very popular on college campuses today. Look, people should be critical and people should focus on race, and all of those things are true. But critical race theory has a particular point of view. One thing it's not is critical race theory. That is, it's not critical of racial politics. It's critical based on race, not critical of scholarship that's based on race. So it's not the kind of thing that I admire among university teachers or university departments, but I wouldn't ban it. Next call is from Alec in Kansas.
I've been anxiously waiting to hear your comments on Section 230. I was wondering if the Facebook and Twitter and so on are acting as publishers rather than just providers. Couldn't someone sue them for something that's posted on their sites, get them into court where they had to say, yes, we are just a provider, so no, we can't be sued for this. And then at that point, someone like the Attorney General of the United States could go and say, listen, you've been doing publisher things and you need to stop doing that, or we're going to take away your Section 230 protections. I probably don't understand this stuff enough at all to even be talking about it, but I'm sure curious.
Not only do you understand it well, but you put it absolutely brilliantly and you hit it right on the head. Facebook and Twitter and others can't have it both ways. They can't have the Section 230 exemption on the ground that they're only platforms, not publishers, and then act as publishers and pick and choose. Yeah, if it's critical of Joe Biden, we're not going to run it. If it's critical of President Trump, we're going to run it, or vice versa, any way you want to do it. Look, Fox is not just a provider. CNN, not just a provider. CNN won't have me on because they think I'm not consistent with their philosophy. And so they don't have exemptions. I'm suing CNN. They don't have exemptions. But Facebook has this exemption, as does Twitter, because they claim not to be like CNN, not to be like Fox. But if they become like CNN and Fox, and they did during the Biden laptop fiasco, then I think they should lose the protection of 230, and I think they will. There's now hearings going on in Congress, led by my former student Ted Cruz, and I think we're going to see some changes. So it was a brilliant question. You know exactly what you're talking about, and nobody should ever be ashamed to ask me a question because they think maybe they don't know the answer or don't know how to formulate the question perfectly. As Thomas Jefferson said a long time ago, you don't have to be a philosopher to make sense. The plowman and the philosopher each present intelligences in a different way. So I want plowmen, plowwomen, philosophers, everybody to ask me their questions on The Durr Show. Well, here's our last caller for today on The Durr Show.
Wouldn't an easy counter to all of this talk about them not being able to censor is the fact that people don't have to actually use these media sources? In terms of, like, I don't have to go to Fox News and put my email in for a newsletter. I don't have to go to CNN and put my email in for a newsletter. So why would I also not have that exact same right to do something like that with Twitter? If I don't like what's on Twitter, wouldn't I just be able to not use it? And yeah, that's my question for you. Thank you.
It's a great question, and I'm sure Twitter and Facebook will come up with that defense. Hey, you don't like us, don't use us. There are always alternatives. The issue is they have a big impact on what Americans do, think, vote. And the antitrust laws, and those are now being invoked, particularly against Google, have to do more with impact on the economy and on competition than with freedom of speech. But the two interact when you have media providers, giant media providers. So all of these things will be put in the mix. And in the end, I think the great First Amendment issue of the next 10 or so years is going to be whether, and if so in what way, the government can in any way regulate private media that have such a public impact. And so keep asking questions about that, and we'll learn together about how the government should properly deal with the mega giants who now so often control what we do, what we think, what we buy, and so many other aspects of American life. So keep thinking, keep asking questions. I'm here to answer. You're going to always get a nonpartisan, unbiased view, never boring, on The Dirt Show. An important part of The Dirt Show is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on The Dirt Show.